Winter descended like an old memory, gentle yet relentless, covering the harsh scars of earth with its quiet forgiveness. It whispered through broken rails and dried branches, softening the brutal corners of existence. Beyond Pine Hollow's borders, where civilization dared not venture with its roads, sat a weathered cabin crafted from ancient timber and deeper solitude. Within these walls moved a woman like mist, hushed, sure-footed, intentional. Bonnie McGuire was her name. 36 winters had passed, though the townsfolk never spoke such numbers aloud. Once they called her a devoted wife while her husband breathed, then a respectable widow when death claimed him. Their regard remained unchanged, save for their diminished expectations. She carried sorrow like others wore their daily garments, fastened around her waist, hands perpetually wiping themselves clean upon it. Yet hers wasn't the grief that screamed into the darkness, or sought solace in drink, or collapsed upon coffin wood. This was the kind that kneaded dough before dawn, repaired clothing for arms that would never fill them, and scrawled thoughts along newspaper edges long past the ink's drying. Her existence flowed with wood smoke and water carrying, tending a gaunt milk goat called Leedy, and grooming the horse she'd never renamed from her husband's choosing, Marshall. Sometimes she'd let the flames dwindle low, testing her tolerance for cold's embrace. It was such bitter weather that altered everything, a consuming frost that split even the mightiest pine timber. That dawn, wind had moaned strangely, not wild, not sorrowful, but cautionary. Bonnie had wrapped herself for the forest, hatchet ready, seeking the final dry kindling before heaven turned crystalline. That's when she discovered him, initially. Merely a form half consumed by white powder. A dark, twisted shape collapsed among undergrowth and fallen timber. She approached cautiously, boots crushing snow, grip firm on the hatchet's handle. A man? No, a shadow of one. His flesh darker than soil, hair woven with beads and crimson. A decorated sash soaked through and frozen to his ribs. Apache. The word entered her mind not as accusation, but as whisper formed by village rumors and hearthside terror. Death was claiming him. This seemed certain. Snow had begun shrouding his legs like final rites. His breathing came shallow, trembling in his throat like a moth trapped in cloth. She stood above him long moments, her own breath blooming as fog. Wisdom, safety, demanded abandonment. Let nature complete its work. But Bonnie McGuire had never embraced Pine Hollow's definition of wisdom. She released the hatchet. It felt less like choosing, more like arriving at a destination she'd been traveling toward for years. Bringing him to shelter consumed half her strength and all her determination. Unconsciousness made him deadweight that sagged and dragged. Her fingers shrieked in the cold, knees bruised from kneeling, back damp with sweat that crystallized. She murmured apologies to the wilderness, to her husband's spirit, to what lay ahead, inside. She positioned him beside the fire, stripped wetness from his limbs, cleansed the gash at his side with steady hands that trembled only afterward. His blood ran darker than hers, richer somehow, like earth after rainfall. She packed the wound with moss and fabric, whispered prayers. She barely recalled how to speak. He remained unconscious. Not that evening nor the next, but breath continued. Bonnie slept in the rocking chair those nights, watching the unknown man with one eye, rifle near, but fear distant. She left water beside him, changed dressings, monitored for death's attention. Through it all, silence reigned. Not spoken, not to him. The cabin assumed new form, as all dwellings do when fragility enters, every sound sharpened. The groan of rafters, fires stirring, winds mutterings through shutters. Quietude no longer felt vacant. It held breath and hope and questions. The fourth morning brought open eyes. They held dark smoke's color, observing her without retreat, though confusion dwelt within them. She met his stare with someone's steadiness who possessed nothing left to trade but honesty. No smile crossed her lips, no gaze averted. "You're safe," she spoke, voice rough from silence, for now. He remained mute. Not then? But his eyes lingered, not on her face, on her hands, bandaged from cold and labor, as if wondering what compelled her to drag him from death's threshold when others would have turned away. Bonnie never requested his name. Names carried power, and it felt premature for power between them. Instead, she contemplated the day townspeople might arrive knocking, what accusations they'd voice, how they'd brand her weak, foolish, even traitorous, but none of that was now. Now meant tea brewed from pine needles and thin broth from bones she'd planned to preserve. Now was the fire and the man who survived. She found herself studying him during sleep, not from fear, which had eased, but from something quieter, more curious. His face showed weathering, but not age. His hands, even in stillness, belonged to someone who understood land better than any map could teach. A scar traced his jaw where steel had once tried stealing his voice. Recovery came slowly, eating little, watching windows more than watching her. Days drifted like smoke ascending a chimney. One evening, as light dissolved into blue, Bonnie sat beside flames reading aloud from an aging farming almanac. Not for him initially, just to hear her voice. Fill silence's cracks, he listened, and she felt it, the shift when presence became companionship. When boundaries between stranger and something else began blurring, once he indicated a word in the book, simple gesture. Wordless, yet it startled her heart. It meant understanding. It meant choosing to remain present. That night she placed an extra blanket by his bedside without explanation. Wind howled outside again. Another tempest approached. She felt it in her teeth, in the ache dwelling in her bones since her husband's passing. Bonnie sat long that evening, eyes closed, listening to his breathing blend with fire's crackling. It struck her quietly, for the first time in countless. Winter's solitude had lifted. She didn't comprehend its meaning. Not yet. But morning's dread had lessened. Beyond the cabin, snow fell in steady drifts, burying tracks and truths alike. Trees whispered to each other in tongues too ancient for human understanding. In Pine Hollow, none knew what the widow had done. Not yet, but winter understands secret-keeping. At least temporarily, days settled into rhythm, soft as breathing, deliberate as snowfall. Within the cabin where only grief once dwelt, fragile, unspoken understanding now flickered. The man, still unnamed though not unacknowledged, gained strength in slow, steady measures. His fever had broken, though the wound remained taut and aching. Bonnie, sleeves perpetually rolled, tended him with the same quiet persistence she gave. Her woodpile or bread dough. She asked nothing, not even his name. What she offered wasn't mercy exactly. It was something slower, deeper, waiting. He spoke no English. Or if he did, silence was his choice. Instead, he nodded when she offered broth, held her gaze longer than necessary, listened as she read from newspapers or yellowing herb journals. Their communication unfolded like cold hands warming beside fire, gradual, uncertain, then unmistakably warm. Sometimes he observed her working, eyes tracking her hands' movement. She worked with grace forged by years of necessity. Even her silences held rhythm. He watched her split wood, kneel in snow, fixing broken fencing, stitch worn coat lining. She moved with stubbornness he recognized, survival, not pride, she called. Him, you, sometimes nothing at all? He never corrected her, and she no longer considered him an intruder. He'd become part of the cabin's breath somehow. An echo given flesh, she found herself brewing a second cup without thinking, brushing snow from windows so moonlight could reach him. One evening, as dusk bruised sky's edges, she discovered him standing barefoot by the door, staring at trees. His hand touched the frame, not to leave, but remembering something, she didn't speak, only offered a blanket, which he accepted without thanks but not without acknowledgement. He began helping in small ways. First, drawing water when her shoulder ached. Then, sweeping floors without request. She noticed but said nothing. Gratitude, she'd learned, was best shown in kind. Words weren't necessary. Their silences stretched long but not lonely. When she read aloud, he sometimes traced shapes in air, sketching something only he could see. Once he pointed at her boot's sketch in dirt, a crooked pine tree, and nodded. She drew another beside it. He smiled slightly, and she realized how young he might be. Not a boy, not age-worn either. Somewhere in that middle space, like her, each night they shared fire and roof, and the invisible tether of two souls with nowhere else to be. But Bonnie knew the world beyond their walls wouldn't be kind if it found him here. Her cabin was temporary. Shelter, never lasting refuge. She knew the town wouldn't understand. Pine Hollow was built on fences, wooden, spoken, unwritten. They held strict expectations for women, for grief, for strangers, especially strangers with his skin, beads in his hair, silence as his first language. She remembered stories her husband once told around fires, stories designed to stir fear. Raids and horse thieves, Apache warriors taking what they wanted, leaving smoke behind. He'd puff his chest while telling them. Other men nodding with comfort of having something to fear more than themselves. Bonnie had nodded too then. Not from belief, but because disbelief didn't change how men chose to live. Now, handing him another cup of tea, fingers brushing his, she felt those stories pressing against her lived truth. This was no monster, no savage. He was a man who flinched when wind howled and sat with quiet reverence before flames. He never asked to stay, but hadn't tried leaving either. Snow outside piled high, walling them in white silence. Time slowed, softened. The world became very small, just two people, a hearth and daily tasks. They shared food, heat, and snow-covered evening stillness. She mended his shirt. Found beads hidden in the hem left untouched. He patched her roof. During brief thaw, hands sure, movements reverent. One morning, she found him watching her feed Leedy. He stood still, arms crossed, brow furrowed as if puzzling something deeper than the task. She caught his eye, tilted her head toward the barn. "You ever keep goats?" she asked, knowing he wouldn't answer. His mouth curled slightly, head shaking. Then he pointed skyward. She looked up, gray clouds rolling. "Storm approaching," he nodded. In that moment, she understood they'd reached an agreement. Wordless and honest. He wouldn't lie, she wouldn't demand. No need existed, the days ahead grew colder. At night, wind groaned through eaves like a mourning voice. Bonnie lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to his breathing from across the room. Not snoring, just breathing, human, alive. Real. Sometimes dreams showed him as she'd found him, half frozen, bleeding into snow. But in dreams, his eyes opened first, always first. And he looked at her not with fear or pleading, but recognition. As if he'd been waiting all along, she woke from those dreams not afraid, but hollowed out. Like the dream had pulled something from her chest, leaving small light behind. One night, after long silence broken only by fire's hiss, he spoke. His voice was quiet, vowels rounded and slow. "Why?" She looked up from sewing. She knew his meaning. Why had she helped? Why not turn away? She considered the fire, her hands shape in her lap, the feeling she'd lacked words for until now. "Because you were dying," she said. He shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving hers. She nodded. "Because I was too." And there it was the first moment not shared, but joined. His face shifted, frown softened by grief, not anger. He looked away only to watch fire, as if reading something in its movement. The next morning, he handed her a carved stick. Not elaborate, but careful. A bird, wings open, not flying, but ready to. She didn't ask its meaning. She understood. His way of saying thank you, or perhaps stay alive. Their daily rhythm didn't change much afterward, but the silences did. No longer gaps, they were bridges. A shared language, not of grammar or sound, but of being seen. Still, Bonnie felt something. Shifting. Not inside the cabin, but beyond it, a sense that the outside world had begun stirring again. That borrowed stillness was about to be reclaimed. One afternoon, while chopping wood, she saw fresh horse tracks cut through snow at treeline, not Tan's. Not hers, too deep, too straight. Someone had come near, maybe watched. She said nothing that night. But sleep eluded her. The next morning, he stood near windows, watching trees. He turned, looked at her. No words needed. She nodded. Something approached, but hadn't arrived yet. So she poured another cup of tea, sat beside him, let silence speak what voices could not. The morning they arrived was soft and silver with frost. Trees stood still as if listening. Snow had hardened. under night's breath, crusted thick where even wind dared not tread. Inside the cabin, air was thick with simmered bean scent and pine smoke. Tan was shaping wood near fire, slow knife strokes, carving grain with patience that reminded Bonnie of ancient rivers. Silent but determined. She was spinning yarn from tangled old wool. Her hands moved without needing to look. They'd grown so accustomed to shared quiet that she almost missed the sound. Hooves, not one, several. They didn't approach fast. Not a raid, not rescue. A decision arriving on horseback, wrapped in coats and law and fear. Bonnie stood slowly, heart climbing to her throat. Tan was already looking at her, his knife stilled. His eyes said what neither would speak aloud. They've come. The knock wasn't a knock. It was fists in command. The door rattled once, twice. She opened it without reaching for her rifle. That would only worsen things. 3 men stood there, breath steaming like war horses, coats dusted white, guns easy on their hips. One was the Sheriff Gregory Kane, salt-bearded man with gravel voice. The others were ranchers, younger but not gentler. "Bonnie," Kane said, tilting his head in mockery of politeness. "We'll go south," she said. He nodded. They rode out before the roof fell, taking the old trail past the dried creek bed. The moon was high and bright, trees silver in its glow. They did not look back, but the world wasn't ready to let them leave. Quietly, just past the ridge, where land dropped into low scrub and air smelled of cedar, the ambush came, 3 riders, guns drawn, shouting, "Stop there!" Bonnie felt her body seize, her heart crack open. Tan pulled the horse up short. He dismounted slowly, arms raised. The leader, a man she didn't know but who wore the same badge Kane once had, pointed a rifle at Tan's chest. "You're harboring a fugitive." Bonnie dismounted too, stepping forward. "He's not a fugitive. He's Apache and he's my husband." That gave them pause, but not enough. "He's under suspicion for an attack on a supply train. Witnesses claim they saw him." "That's not possible," Bonnie said, voice flat. "He's been with me," one of the men laughed. "That's what you'd say, isn't it?" Tan said nothing. Then suddenly he stepped forward, out of reach of her grasp. "Let her go," he said. "You don't speak for her," the leader snapped. "I speak to protect her," Tan said. "You want blood? I'm giving you a target, not her." "No," Bonnie said, stepping beside him. "We stand together." The leader lifted his rifle. It happened fast, too fast to stop. A shot, then another, but not at Tan. Bonnie stumbled. For a second, everything was still. Then Tan caught her in his arms, lowering her gently to the ground. Her side was wet. Not fatal, but bleeding fast. She blinked up at him, dazed. "I'm all right," she whispered. "Stay." The men were shouting now, arguing. One of them had fired without command. Tan rose slowly, cradling her head in the crook of his coat, then turned to face them. "She is not your enemy," he said. "Neither am I." He lifted his hands again. The tension in the clearing cracked open. The second rider, younger, dismounted. He stepped forward, rifle lowered. "This ain't justice," he said. "She's bleeding. This ain't right." The leader hesitated. The spell broke. "We're done here," the young man said. The others, unsure now, followed him back. They left just like that. Tan fell to his knees beside Bonnie, tore strips from his cloak, pressed them to the wound. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "I did." Later, she would not remember the ride south, only the warmth of his arms, the murmur of his voice, the steadiness of his breath. They found shelter in a hidden hollow where wind spoke a different language, and no one looked for names. Tan cared for her there, building fires from damp wood, boiling roots, changing her dressings. She healed. In time, she walked again. In time, they planted seeds in soil that had never known violence. They lived without names, without papers, without the weight of any past but their own choosing. Some nights they sat by fire and spoke softly of things once feared. Bonnie would trace the scar by her ribs and say, "It was worth it." Tan would place her hand over his heart and say, "So were you." And if travelers passed through, they never asked questions. But some, those with eyes shaped by sorrow, would pause and listen to wind in trees. They'd hear fire crackle. They'd notice the carved bird hanging above hearth. And they'd know that somewhere out in the wide and wild west, two souls had once refused to be separated. Not by bullets, not by borders, not even by silence. And that they had chosen each other again and again until the world ran out of reasons to say no, need to talk. Her mouth was dry. "You're early for coffee?" "No one's here for coffee," said the left one, sharp-jawed boy named Virgil, who'd once courted her niece. "He's in there, ain't he?" Bonnie didn't look back. "He's healing." Kane stepped forward, boots crunching frozen threshold. "That man in there, he's Apache? We've had reports? You know what kind of trouble that brings?" She looked him in the eye. "I know what kind of trouble fear creates." "Don't test me, Bonnie," Kane said, voice low, almost sad. "People are stirred up. He's not safe here. And you," he stopped, eyes flickering past her shoulder, "you're making things harder than they need to be." Those words carried weight, heavy and lined with threat. Bonnie didn't move aside. "He's not a threat," Virgil stepped forward. "You don't know that. He could have been part of the raid near Dry Ridge. Took 3 horses and 2 lives. He's been in this cabin over a month," she said. "I pulled him from snow." "You think he rode out from Dry Ridge while bleeding to death in darkness?" The third man, silent until now, shifted uneasily. His eyes met hers with doubt's flicker. He knew she spoke truth, but knowing truth was never enough in Pine Hollow. You had to want it. Kane exhaled long. "Bonnie, listen. We can't have him here. Not like this. Folks are scared. They need resolution." The word sat foul in air. As if justice could be measured like grain, Bonnie stepped back, not in fear but in surrender to inevitability. "If you want him, you'll have to see him." Kane nodded. Virgil's hand twitched near his belt, but Kane gestured him down. "Easy. Just a look." They entered with muddy boots still on. Tan stood at hearth, not holding weapons, not speaking, just watching. The sheriff looked at him long and careful. Tan didn't flinch. His face was stone, but his eyes weren't. They held calm and something deeper, contempt maybe, or grief or exhaustion from being judged by his skin's shape. "He doesn't look much like a threat," the quiet man murmured. Virgil snorted. "Give him a rifle. See how fast that changes." Tan said nothing. Bonnie stepped closer to him, placing herself between fire and men. Not dramatically, just choosing Kane. Rubbed his beard. "Here's what we'll do," he said finally. "We don't want blood. No need for more war. But we can't just let him go. Not after what's happened in these parts. It'd break the town in 2. Bonnie's jaw tightened. "So what do you want?" Kane looked at her like the answer was simple. "You're a widow. He's in your home. You saved his life. You're all the family he's got in this county. So make it legal." She blinked. "Legal? A marriage," Kane said. "Paper makes things cleaner. If he's your husband, he's one of us. That's how we keep peace." Virgil laughed. Sharp, mean sound. "That's rich. Make her marry the savage." Kane shot him a glare, but damage was done. The room turned colder. Bonnie looked at Tan. His face hadn't changed, but something in him had gone very still. He was hearing words, understanding enough. She whispered, "They'll kill you if I say no." He nodded once, not to agree, to accept. She looked back at Kane. "You can draw up the papers." The next 2 hours passed like days. They brought the town clerk. They brought a preacher. They didn't bring celebration or smiles, just ink and obligation and a room full of eyes that didn't see them. Only what they wanted to believe. The wedding was performed in the cabin. Bonnie wore her boots, dress hem smudged with ash. Tan wore the same clothes he'd nearly died in. No vows, no ring exchange, just signatures. The clerk scrawled their names, misspelling Tan's with something closer to Thomas, and no one corrected. When the preacher said, "Amen," Bonnie didn't feel married. She felt claimed. She felt like land, like cattle, like something bartered. Tan stood beside her. Statue carved from dignity and silence. Kane clapped his shoulder. "Welcome to Pine Hollow." Then they left, all of them. The door shut with finality that echoed too. Loud for long moments, neither moved. Bonnie finally turned to him. "I didn't want that," she said softly. I wanted you to live, he nodded, then sat by fire. The carving knife returned to his hand. His fingers worked wood into shape. She watched him, the way his shoulders curved inward slightly, as if survival's weight was heavier than death had been. Sun had dipped low. The cabin, quiet again, now held different silence, thicker, more complicated, not peace, not even truce. Just endurance. She sat across from him, hands clasped in her lap. The paper with their names sat on the table like a verdict, but she didn't look at it. She looked at Tan. He looked back. And for the first time she saw something not just behind his eyes, but rising toward them. Not gratitude, not warmth, something harder, like resolve. Bonnie reached forward, picked up the carved bird he'd been working on. Wings were just beginning to take shape. Finish it, she said. He took it from her slowly. Outside, wind began shifting. The storm that had loomed for weeks was moving off, but sky remained gray. Inside, they stayed seated, still as mountains, waiting for the next truth to come. The papers made it real for the town, but not for them. Inside the cabin where fire still whispered and snow still held to windows like lace. Nothing had shifted except the weight of what had been taken from choice and turned into decree. Tan moved through the cabin with the same silence he always had. His hands still worked wood, still mended firewood piles without being asked. He still fetched water before dawn and left it by the hearth, but now something in him moved a beat slower, as if air itself had grown heavier, walls too narrow. Bonnie felt it too, though she kept her chin high and voice measured. She made their meals, swept floors, tended animals, and kept silence between them from turning brittle. The strange thing, she didn't feel anger. Not at Tan, not even at men who forced their names together with ink and suspicion. What she felt was stranger than anger. It was hunger. Hunger to know who he was beyond what they'd made him. One morning, before fire caught, she found him sitting outside on steps, breath rising in clouds. Snow had melted just enough to reveal patches of brown earth beneath pines. He didn't turn when she stepped beside him, didn't speak, but she could feel his thoughts shape in the cold. "Do you want to leave?" she asked softly. His gaze didn't shift. Yes, no apology in it, no shame, just truth. She nodded. "I wouldn't stop you. I know." They sat like that long. Shoulders not touching, but near. Wind stirred trees, and somewhere distant a hawk called out once, then vanished into sky. He rose, then slow, and went inside. She stayed. That day she stitched new linings into their coats. His was worn thin under the arms. Her fingers moved with care, remembering how her mother used to repair things, quietly, without mention, as if the work of keeping things together was the closest thing to love they ever dared speak aloud. The next night, Tan left the bird carving by her place at the table. It was finished now, wings spread, body poised in flight. She picked it up, traced grain with her thumb, then looked across at him. "Did it mean something?" she asked. He studied her long, then, "Yes." She waited. He hesitated, then answered with effort. "In my people's stories, birds carry messages between worlds. Is this a message?" "Yes." Her voice dropped. "What does it say?" His eyes softened. "That I stayed." She held the carving closer and nodded once. It was more than thanks, more than gift. It was memory carved into shape, quiet proof that he'd once chosen to remain even before the town had forced the word husband onto him. They began speaking more after that. Not often, not fluently, but in short, deliberate exchanges. Words he'd learned over weeks of listening began finding their way out, shaped by his accent, his cadence. Her words, slower now, met him in the middle, neither filled air with sound, just to claim it. Every word they gave each other was a stone placed in a bridge. She learned his name wasn't Thomas as papers claimed. His name was Tan, meaning new moon, though he said it without flourish, without pride. "My mother gave it," he said one evening. "What was she like?" He was quiet long, then, "Strong?" She did not bow. Bonnie nodded. "I'd have liked her." "She would." "Not like this," he said, gesturing faintly to paper pinned above hearth. "I don't like it either," she admitted. He looked at her then, not with guarded distance he'd held since beginning, but with something closer to regard. They began sharing more than work after that. He helped her fix the chicken coop. She showed him how to brew pine tea the way her grandmother taught her. Letting needles steep long enough to stain water amber. He drew maps in dirt outside, places she'd never heard of, places that lived in his memory's landscape. He pointed once to distant mountains. My people walked there before soldiers came. Bonnie didn't ask which soldiers. She already knew. They burned our homes, he said simply. We buried our names in snow. She couldn't speak for a moment. Her fingers closed around the wooden bird in her pocket. I'm sorry, she said at last. He looked at her and something passed through his face, soft like wind. You didn't hold the torch. No, she whispered. But I live in the house it lit. Tan didn't answer, but he didn't look away. In the weeks that followed, a kind of tenderness bloomed. Not fast, not bright, but persistent like moss in shadow. They moved around each other with less distance, sometimes brushing past in the kitchen, or handing tools back and forth without thinking. One morning, she found him humming low as he chopped wood. It wasn't a song she knew, but it calmed her. She began humming it later when she washed dishes. He noticed, smiled faintly, but said nothing. The town kept its distance, but not its whispers. Supplies came with tight-lipped glances. The preacher's wife no longer waved. Bonnie didn't mind. Their disapproval's weight was less than pretending's weight. One market day, she rode into town alone. The clerk gave her change without meeting her eyes. A boy spit near her boots and muttered something cruel. She didn't flinch. On the way home, she passed the creek where she and her husband used to fish in silence. Water still moved, still laughed. Over stones. She realized she hadn't thought of her husband in days, not with sorrow, not with love, just silence. Back at the cabin, Tan had made stew. The scent greeted her like memory. He'd even split the last dried herbs into the pot. She sat beside him and ate without speaking. When the bowl was empty, she said, "Thank you." He nodded. "You came back." "I said I would, I know." She reached across the table, laid fingers over his, not fully grasping, just touching. "Do you ever wish it had gone differently?" she asked. His thumb moved slightly beneath hers. "Sometimes," she waited, "but not every day." That night, as fire cracked and snow fell gently, Bonnie reached for his hand again. This time he held it, neither moved. Beyond that, no kiss, no promises, just hands clasped, warm in the hush. A week later they were building fence together. The posts had rotted and leaned like weary men. She held them straight as he hammered. At one point she lost balance and fell into him. He caught her. Their eyes met close enough to feel each other's breath. He didn't kiss her, but he didn't move away. They finished the fence in silence. That evening, she found an old tin box and filled it with seeds she'd been saving for spring, even though she hadn't planned to plant them. She handed the box to Tan. "For the garden?" she said. He opened it, sifted through seeds with care. "You believe we'll still be here?" She thought long. "Then I believe I want to be." He closed the box and nodded. "Then we plan." There were nights when they still said nothing, but silence no longer felt empty. It was a shared quilt wrapped around what couldn't be spoken and didn't need to be. One such night, she sat with a letter in her lap. It was from her sister, full of concern and questions and quiet condescension. Bonnie read it aloud in pieces. She says I should come live with her, that I've lost my way. Tan was stirring fire. He didn't look up. "Have you?" She folded the letter. "No, I think I finally found it." He met her gaze and said, "Then burn it." She did. In winter's final weeks, something changed again. Not between them, but around them, the woods grew restless. Tan watched tree lines longer each day. One evening, he stood outside long after light had gone, listening. When he came in, Bonnie saw tension in his shoulders. She didn't ask. That night, he said quietly, "There's talk among the pines, I feel it." She placed her hand over his. "If it comes, we'll face it." He didn't argue. In the cabin, the paper with their names still hung above hearth, but it no longer defined them. Their bond had shifted, no longer forged by fear or decree, but chosen in hours and work and touch. They had not spoken of love. Not yet. But something deeper had rooted itself. something gentler than passion and stronger than names, and though neither could say what spring would bring, they both planted the garden together. Without a word, wind had changed again. It came down from north like breath held too long, dry and sharp, tasting faintly of smoke. Not the kind that rose gently from homestead chimneys, but harsh, bitter scent of something distant and burning. Tan smelled it before Bonnie did. He stood in the doorway at dawn, bare feet pressed against old pine floor, and did not speak. The horizon was still quiet, sky the color of old iron, but something in trees had gone silent, not Peace's silence, but the pause before reckoning. Bonnie came behind him, still tying her shawl. She followed his gaze and knew without asking. The fire they'd kept carefully at bay was drawing close, not flames in trees, but in eyes of men who decided once more that fear was easier to carry than understanding. That afternoon, a rider passed the cabin without slowing. No wave, no words, just a hard look and faster pace when Tan stepped into view. Bonnie recognized the man. He worked for the town store, the same one who'd refused to sell her thread the week before unless she paid in coin, not eggs. She watched him disappear between trees and knew it wouldn't be long now. Tan didn't speak of it. He returned to the garden, checking tender shoots they'd planted just weeks before. Their roots were shallow still. He brushed dirt from a stalk and looked at it the way one might look at a child's first drawing, proud, worried, already bracing for when that might come to tear it loose. Bonnie joined him, kneeling beside the small patch of hope. "We'll lose them," she said. He didn't ask what she meant. Whether seedlings or something more, he only said, "Not yet." That night, they didn't light the lantern. They sat in near darkness, fire banked low. The carved bird rested on the mantel, watching them. Tan's hands were steady around his cup, but Bonnie could see the storm behind his eyes. He was thinking of his people, of friends who hadn't returned from woods, of ones whose names were never written down because paper refused to hold them. She saw him weighing the balance between staying and leaving, between surviving and being free. "You don't have to stay," she said, words brittle in her mouth. "Not for me," he didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the pouch he kept tucked behind stacked firewood. From it, he drew something small wrapped in soft leather. He placed it on the table between them. Inside was a necklace, strung with smooth bone beads, dyed cords, and a single carved stone, green and veined like moss. "My sister made it," he said, "before we were scattered." Bonnie touched it, careful not to displace its shape. "It's beautiful." She wore it when she ran. Bonnie looked up. "Did she make it far?" "No." Silence held. "She'd like you," he added, voice low. Tears stung her eyes, sudden and fierce. "You don't know that." "I do," he said. She saw people, not fences. The next morning, smoke was visible, a thin line of it against pale blue sky, rising from pines north of the ridge. Tan watched it without blinking. Bonnie felt it in her stomach first, coiling dread that wrapped itself tight. It wasn't just fire, it was signal. Someone had lit it not to burn, but to draw others in. By midday, tracks began appearing. Hoofprints in thawing mud, white boots and snow-melted brush. She saw them when she went to check trap lines. Fresh, deliberate, Tan met her halfway back, his bow in hand. Not raised, not drawn, just held like something remembered rather than wielded. They spoke without speaking. Bonnie packed what little she needed, flask, dried meat, a few books. Tan packed nothing. He'd never claimed any part of the cabin as his. He looked at it now the way a man might look at a place he'd already buried. "I want to burn it," he said quietly that evening. Bonnie didn't flinch. "Then we burn it, but not because we're afraid." "No," he said, "because it's time." They waited until dusk. Tan lit the fire from inside, starting at hearth. It was slow too. Catch, reluctant almost. Old wood creaked and hissed as it began accepting its fate. Bonnie stood outside, holding the carved bird. She did not cry. Not this time. As flames climbed, she watched smoke twist into branches. It was not smoke of anger or destruction. It was funeral pyre for who they had been, for the place that had once been shelter and prison. Both. Tan stood beside her, face lit orange and gold. She reached for his hand. He took it.